But joining us is our friend, Father Kenneth Tanner. And I don't want to make assumptions, Ken. Can you introduce yourself for us?
Sure. Yeah, I wondered if people thought that Josh just aged by 30 years on a, you know.
Oh.
Oh my God. Kenneth Tanner, pastor of Holy Redeemer in north of Detroit. Um, as Jason likes to say, I'm Anglican adjacent. Um, and love the work of the pastoral office and yeah, so that's me.
And you're a good writer. And speaking of writing, I don't know that I know your sensibilities in many ways align with Stanley's work. But maybe you can get us started again by just telling us a little overview of how you came across Stanley Hauerwas and what of his work has resonated with you in your priesthood.
Yeah. I've been interested in what he's doing since I was in college, and first learned about him and Will Willimon and the books that they were writing back in those days, and got a privilege to when I moved to Chicago. I was in working in a situation where I got to see him in a number of conference settings and churches and listen to him and get to know him some. And he's just, I just love his irascibility and he's so edgy. And I mean, at Wheaton, I don't know, I think he does this anymore, but he gave a talk and he was dropping F bombs at Wheaton, and I thought, man, this is incredible. But I mean, seriously, uh, I just think he's a Christian, you know, and that is what really interests me about him is that he actually does. I mean, he believes the stuff, and he trusts Jesus, and it's what logic did he brings to bear to what feeling he brings to bear is coming from a connection and experience with Jesus Christ. you
Hmm.
know so the reason I end up in the same spot with him so often is I think we're trying to follow the same person.
Hmm.
you know
Okay.
so
And so one of the things I appreciate about Stanley, you say that he's a Christian. Stanley is consistently reluctant to grab onto that title for himself, that he wants um, the people around him to identify him in that way. Um,
uh,
and and I think that's a helpful lesson in that Stanley seeks the wisdom of the saints, the living saints, to kind of check his work, right? And Ken, this is something you've done with me before, like reached out to like make sure that what you've written or thinking is, if I think it's in line with the
100%.
gospel too. And we don't do that enough,
Yeah.
right? And I think in a culture of hot takes, um, our hot takes kind of just disappear, but
Yeah.
people don't seek out people to hold them accountable, to the gospel and to their Christian
Yeah.
convictions. And I think it's especially important now. So we're talking about the last section of this book. And it's about the political witness of the church. And we're talking about it at a time where the U.S. has bombed nuclear sites in Iran, which is that's the wisdom of that politically could be debated. But then, Stanley wants to insist here in the very first chapter, um, the first task of the church is the title. It's taken from A Community of Character, one of his best books, I think. And he wants to insist that it's not the job of the church to make the world come out right. That Jesus is Lord and like he's got that. It's the task of the church to be the church. Um, so yeah, I'm just going to ask the two of you to unpack what the first task of the church means.
Mm. Todd, I'm gonna let you start. that.
Um, yeah, I think he's going to insist that the first task of the church is to bear witness to Jesus. I think that that may sound overly simplified, but I think he's trying to parse the distinction um, between the church having a position and being a position, or
Mm-hmm.
as he puts it, the church does not have a social ethic. The church is a social ethic. So, in that particular framing, the church, I think, as we've used the phrase before, um, it is the witness, is the bodily witness to the risen Lord, and as such, then its um, way in the world is determined, empowered, if you will, by the Spirit, who is um, always drawing attention to Jesus. So I think that I think it's a really a good point to make, because especially in a day where um, you said it, everyone is required to have a hot take. Um, whereas the church is a communal response, as opposed to the difference of opinions I might make about a particular event or action, say the bombing of nuclear sites in Iran. So I think that's his insistence, that the church is the body that bears witness to the risen Jesus.
Yeah. So, Ken, you're someone who has experience in a holiness tradition, but also in a highly liturgical tradition. Talk about so there's a way of thinking about the liturgy and the church year, and the church calendar, that fits with what Stanley's talking about here. Um, can you kind of contrast the two different kinds of um, church spaces that you've occupied in your life, and how they differ in terms of witness?
Yeah, I mean, I think joy and exuberance is at the heart of holiness and Pentecostal tradition. It's immediate. It's very focused on what's happening, you know, in the gathered community at that time. Sometimes that's, looking for, some novel thing or some novel word or what have you. Some of it is trying to relive experiences that have happened in the past, but there's joy there, for sure. But I think there's nothing that in terms of my pastoral practice, that I found, making disciples, that's more effective than the sacred year. I mean, plunging ourselves year after year after year into the life of Jesus, the time of the human God among us, just showing us, what it means to be human, what it means to be God, um, from the journey from Advent to Pentecost. It is so rich. And you keep seeing different facets of his life and what it means to be God, what it means to be human. And so that's part of it for sure. I think Stanley is also talking about preaching that simply, proclaims the Lord, and his life and what he is trying to teach us. Catechizing our young people, and celebrating the Eucharist and baptizing infants and all these things, is to trust that the preached word, the baptismal font, the meal, the sacred year, is going to make of us a community that takes care of the poor. It's going to make us a community that welcomes strangers. It's going to make us a community that looks for the release of prisoners, that seeks the healing of all humans. So, and teach us to love each other, right? So, we do literally have. I mean, and that's the question: do we trust being the church? Will that make us a community that makes it? That sees Jesus as the difference. You know, so That instead of trying to, as Stanley says, trying to make a difference in the world, be the community that shows that he's the difference, and he's the difference as us. So.
Yeah, that's Philip Carey's critique of so much Christianity is churches where I go on Sunday morning to hear what God is up to everywhere but the church. That I thought that has stuck with me. Yeah. And so on 115, Stanley writes, the world needs the church, but not to help it run more smoothly or make it a better and safer place for Christians to live. Rather, the world needs the church because without the church, the world does not know what it is or who God is. The only way for the world to know that it is being redeemed is for the church to point to the Redeemer by being a redeemed people. The way for the world to know that it needs redeeming, that it is broken and fallen, is for the church to enable the world to strike hard against something that is an alternative to what the world offers. Todd, I think one of the things I appreciate about Stanley and Will, both, as kind of the healthiest exemplifications of Wesleyanism, I think, is that holiness, Christian witness, sanctification, the law, it's not for the purpose of browbeating people. It's not for the purpose of producing anxiety in worshipers or sermon hearers or any of that. It's there's no anxious bench. There's no threat of hell because Jesus is Lord and everything else is bullshit, right? But for the sake of the world, Christians need to look different, and that's a more gracious frame, I think, on the vocation given to us. Does that make sense?
No, I think so. Not being from a particularly Wesleyan tradition, although we sure love Wesley's hymns, I think that for our particular group to kind of, if I can, play you and Ken off of one another in your backgrounds, is to say that for most Baptists, at least us older ones, the insistence on holiness was always personal and individual. And so the emphases were less on a particularly way the church's community bore witness in the world,
right?
But what sort of character you developed as an individual person. And so all the insistence was on your own personal pieties. So the law became more about how do you do that. And so enter a hyper, if it's possible to think hyper today, in contrast today, a hyper sense of formative practices. And so in that wing, you're always looking for what practices are forming us. I had a conversation with a young church planter today, and that was one of the things that he was wrestling with, but not on an individual level. What are the things that we would do, like what Ken describes, that forms our community of faith to bear witness to Jesus? And what would that look like? And so it was he came to faith in a Baptist church in high school, and so he didn't have a lot of the earlier stuff that I would have grown up with, where hyper individualized. But I think that's instructive to hear someone like Stanley and Will, because it locates the person in a community such that if we're going to be honest about those things that might form us, whatever disciplines or practices, they result in the sorts of things that Ken was pointing to that will shape us to look for the release of prisoners, if you will. Those things don't become new laws or new expressions for the community, but it's the byproduct of the Spirit at work in the body to produce the sorts of things that we witness Jesus doing. And I think that's a real welcome emphasis from Stanley and from Will that attracted me all those years ago in the first book I read that they authored together. So.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Will's great strength is presenting he often portrays in his preaching discipleship, not as a process or a regimen or anything like that, but just like the adventure of following the Jesus who is not dead. The Jesus might call you to surprising things. And so that's a freeing way of thinking about distinctiveness. And Stanley, I think because he grew up a bricklayer and blue collar, here's all the stuff that like you get to do, that makes you a Christian. And so it's Luther's right that the law accuses, but it does so because we're sinners. Like God telling us what to do shouldn't afflict us. So one of the examples Stanley gives here, and I think this is on 117. It's so when you hear part of the challenge with Stanley is that he's good at crafting one-liners that it may be pleasing to the ear, it might make you smile, but sometimes it's not clear like what he's actually saying, right? And so the first task of the church is not to make the world more just, but to make the world the world. And so to clarify these one-liners, it's important to come up with examples, concrete representations of what he's saying. And so, this is from A Community of Character, which he wrote in the late 70s. And so, and he started out as a more strict kind of Christian ethicist, and so his early books are much more concerned there. But he turns to an example like abortion. And so he says, so our response to an issue like abortion is something communal, social, and political, but utterly ecclesial, something like baptism. Whenever a person is baptized, the church adopts that person into a new family. Therefore, we cannot say to the pregnant 15-year-old, abortion is a sin, it is your problem. Rather, it is our problem. We ask ourselves what sort of church we need to be to enable an ordinary person like her to be the sort of disciple that Jesus calls her to be. And that's just, you can take what he's doing there and apply it to almost any issue, right? That when Stanley talks about being the first task of the church, he's saying that, yes, Kenneth Tanner as a Christian has convictions on X, Y, and Z issues, but it is not Kenneth Tanner's primary vocation to go demonstrate, advocate, legislate those convictions. It's first of all to try to do what he can to help his local congregation embody those convictions.
Right.
And so having the right position on issue A or B, and then trying to get your elected representatives to act accordingly, that's not our task, right? It's to how do we as Christians embody. I remember those two fake journalists, comedians, like in the Daily Show vein, that are on Twitter. I can't remember. They frequently go to Trump rallies and stuff. I remember a video of them at a March for Life rally and going up to and well, how many kids have you adopted? Oh, well, none.
Right.
That's the kind of thing that Stanley is pushing for.
Yeah. And I think if we're following Jesus, the embodiment of that, of the convictions, is weighs heavily on the side of mercy.
Mm-hmm.
So we should surprise people both with the seriousness of our conviction about not killing, but it should hit the high note of that should hit. Man, they're so merciful in the way they hold this,
Mhm.
you know, and that is not, I think, unfortunately, it's to be to have to take some tough positions and hard positions. We've all seen, everybody wants to do that and seem like the right, people are doing the right thing or pushing the right thing. But to do it with so much mercy that people are actually able to hear,
Mhm.
why we think that this is so vital,
Yeah. Yeah.
that we don't kill our children and we don't kill our elderly.
Yeah, and you can this what's oh, it seems to me that, like, when it comes to baptism, we either interpreted it um um sacramentally in a very high theological way,
Yeah.
or we interpret it as in terms of a decision to obey Christ and follow. Um, and what I think what Stanley's gesturing towards is you can have both. That
Yeah.
baptism isn't just God's act that transfers you from the old age to the new and clothes you in Christ, and makes you a part of this story. It's also this miracle, where God acts in time to transfer my biological child, say, to the ownership of a whole group of people. But that's real. That's not symbolic or rhetorical. It's like, no, this child now belongs to all of you. That's
I think
Yeah.
you emphasize from time to time in your preaching and that were it not for the gospel, none of us would choose to be together on a Sunday morning, for instance. And he says, he closes out that chapter. The most interesting creative political solutions we Christians have to offer our troubled society are not new laws, advice to policymakers, or increased funding for social programs, although we may support such efforts from time to time. The most creative social strategy we have to offer is to be the church. Here we show the world a manner of life that it can never achieve through social coercion or governmental action. Here it is. We serve the world by showing it something that it is not, namely, a place where God is forming a family out of strangers. And I think that's not always well understood.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. No, in this day and age, or our moment, one of the marks of the church might be that it's, a healthy church, is a place where progressive and conservatives can be together, around the story of Jesus and the table and baptism and, our concerns, and live with each other,
Yeah.
The,
so.
the late Mike
Amen.
Giaconelli, the late Mike Giaconelli told the story one time in a sermon about the little church that he served in Wairika, California, and he was trying to play this point. So I don't know. He probably had read some Stanley. He seems to be in that vein, or have been in that vein before he died. And at any rate, he's like, we act like everybody ought to get along. He says, Jesus is so disruptive that we ought to have a fight in the parking lot after church every Sunday morning. It was obviously hyperbole, but his point being that learning how to be community requires some stretching, straining, growing, learning through the differences that are present when we gather. And so I think that another mark of the more contemporary American church is we don't think it's a value that progressives and conservatives are in fellowship together. If you're progressive, you go over there. We've self-selected our own silos, and I don't think that's healthy for the world either.
Not at all.
Yeah, Ken. One of the things you and I have in common is a great affection for the late Robert Jensen.
Yeah.
And this is a way that I
Affection's the right word.
I in thinking about Stanley's recommendations, this is I often think about Jensen, right? Because Jensen started out as a civil rights activist, opponent to the Vietnam War, and then when it came to Roe v. Wade, was chagrined to find that his advocacy for the defenseless didn't extend to that issue, and he felt as though the people he had been protesting with were not actually doing so out of their Christian convictions, but were doing so for political reasons. And so he felt, felt alienated, and then kind of was strange bad companies with other people towards the end of his career, but that's kind of what Stanley's he's insisting that the Christians engage as Christians, not Christians, not Democrats and Republicans who happen to be Christian, and that's what we have too much of.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it does kind of come down to the question of imposition and coercion versus showing a different way, and I think where we began to impose, which Jesus doesn't do, and coerce, which our God doesn't do, the love that is supposed to be converting is not communicated, because you can't impose and coerce some of this, and or you can't really any of it. And so you got somebody like Jens, who comes from a solid rock conviction about the equality of all human beings. That's why he's in the civil rights marches and so forth. But then that equality extends to the elderly. That equality extends to our children. And equality extends to everyone. Whereas Tom, Tom had bought everything hook, line, and sinker. That Tom Oden. That this was just the righteous thing to do, and everything like that. And it was reading the church fathers that he began to be convinced. Whoa, this some of these things I've believed, from being a liberal Democrat from Oklahoma my whole life, don't line up with with the Christian faith, and I better start checking myself. And you learn that from Will Herbert, who's a Jew, because he had to be in conversation with Will, and Will's quoting Augustine and Gregor Nyssa and Maximus, and Tom's like, well, I never even heard of these people. He says, well, stop talking theology to me until you go and read some your own sources, and then we'll have some conversation. But it was in reading the First Christians that he began to realize, I haven't been formed by this, this community, So.
And that's a good, I don't know that we've talked about it in reading this book, Todd, but one of the things I admire about Stanley is from his starting out as a student at Yale to now being an old man and still writing, is he's not the same person. And I think it comes across in this book a little bit, that he has for a lifetime befriended people from different traditions. So like his friendship with a Mennonite changed the whole tenor of his preaching and writing. His friends in the Catholic Church made him more sacramental.
Yes,
his friends with Jews has completely impacted how he reads the Bible. And so there's I think in him there is a witness that's applicable to all of us, that we should have friends beyond our particular communities and confessions. And we should trust the gospel enough to allow those friendships to change us. that we should hold our traditions and commitments lightly enough so that friendship can change us.
Yes.
Amen.
Yeah.
I mean,
Amen. 100%.
if you had told me as like, a rabid Bardian at Princeton 25 years ago, that, one day I would be friends with a charismatic Anglican that I haven't even met in the flesh, I'd be like, what are you smoking?
That is wrong. That's wrong. We have that you and I and Todd haven't met. We gotta figure this out. I guess I got to get to Mockingbird. I got to get to something that you guys we all appreciate. If I can see you in person, it's I mean, it's almost a decade now. I've been hanging with these guys. We've never met in the flesh. We're gonna figure that out. Yeah, I was just listening. Irenaeus talks, on the regular feed about, the laying of mosaic floors in the ancient world, and how there's an hypothesis on the back of the stones. Somebody in Byzantium's making this floor, and they're going to ship it to Rome or someplace. You have to have a key on the back, an hypothesis that helps the artisan that receives it to put it back together so that you don't end up with the snake or the fox. You end up with the image of the shepherd king and so forth.
Mhm.
But I've kind of I forgot the name of the language and music, but transcribe, or that, no, it's a different
Transpose.
transpose. That to this, like, my Pentecostal forebears had pieces of the mosaic, and the Eastern Christians for me in the second, third, and fourth centuries have had pieces of the mosaic for me. Some of the rabbis have pieces of the mosaic for me, and Jason's giving me some of the pieces of the mosaic, and Fleming, and people coming from all sorts of different backgrounds are giving me pieces of the mosaic, and I need the whole church in order to see the image of Jesus.
Yeah.
And it's so vital. I hope everybody, can get to a place where they really do, seek outside their own sector, whatever they were raised in, and to get to the deeper waters. That's what happens when we start to listen to people across the church and even outside the church and the synagogue, and just our neighbors. And I when I was riding the trains and the buses and the subways in Chicago, and just talking to ordinary people, I began to get pieces of the mosaic from them too. And sometimes they were just asking me what I thought about this or that because they found out I was a priest. And we can learn, we can hear the voice of Christ all over the place.
And that's a good. It's not germane to this section of the book, but it is the stand. So right before the terrorist attacks on September 11th, Time magazine named Stanley Hauerwas America's best theologian. And Stanley likes to say that best is not a theological category. But so he is renowned, right? Published lots of books. But he again is reluctant to identify himself as any sort of exceptional Christian. He often says that God's not there for him in the way that God is there for his wife. That he labors at his prayers because prayer does not come naturally to him. And I think so. Stanley's a reminder in that way that he's doing theology for people who are better Christians than him, is how he perceives it. And I'm confident that the two of you, being clergy from other traditions, frequently encounter the fact that lay people are very often stronger believers than their clergy are.
Yeah.
And so they do help put stitch the tapestry together. Because the doubts and the equivocations and the pulling of the punches that seminary gives you a lot of times lay people are free of those.
A lot of times.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, I think, one thing that I would say about Stan, if I were in the same room, I would say that you've definitely become, someone who has worked on himself to have the mind of Christ, and I think that's, some people get converted, in their emotions. Nobody ever loved them. They come from a lot of trauma. They come from situations where, and Jesus is, their conversion is a heart, like a feeling, some people like really struggle with like things that, are besetting for them, like alcoholism and so forth and so on. And their conversion happens because Jesus gives them the willpower to overcome the heroin or whatever it is, and some people, the conversion begins in the mind, right? It's a kind of a tutorial that happens there. Sometimes those people don't have as much of the will hasn't been straightened out as much, or the feelings haven't been straightened out. Some people's feelings are all straightened out, but their mind is, not right. And I think that's an important pastoral tool. And I'm getting this from Gregory and in the pastoral rule, just to kind of understand where we're starting with the people who are coming, or anyone, even brothers that we know, is to recognize that, this kind of work that Jesus is doing, and some people needs, a little bit of assist, you need to help them along in the way of feeling, or they need to be helped along in the way of the will, or in the way of the way they think. And then it's a journey. Sanctification, is a journey, and identifying those places where we've God has done the work in us, and identifying the places where God hasn't done the work in helping us to
Mhm.
come and get touch with that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
but I would encourage him that he's definitely. I mean, I would never like. I would always be pretty confident I'm getting the mind of Christ when I when I'm listening to Stanley or reading him. Whatever his feelings are about his will or his his
And
emotion.
yeah, and I mean, and this gets to the last entry in this devotional, the difference Christ makes, which is the title of the Festschrift for Stanley on his retirement. I think it was Sam Wells's tribute to him. That Stanley has tried to live the difference that Christ makes in the world. And so like the church is not to make the world make the world different. The church is called to be the place, the difference that Christ has made in the world. And I think with Stanley, Ken, you've talked about coercion, and it's Marshall McLuhan, right? The medium is the message. And so if you're screaming at me about the love of Jesus Christ, I don't believe it. If you're talking about, and that's Jensen too, right? That like justification by faith is a rule of speech. And so if you're communicating the gospel to me in a way that doesn't sound like, yeah, if it doesn't sound like good news, you're doing it wrong.
Doing it wrong.
and I think
if it doesn't sound like mercy, you're doing it wrong.
And so I think one of like the things I admire about Stanley is that he doesn't lose the lordship of Christ or the grace and love of God, but at the same time he is always he is always polemical. He's always making an argument.
Oh, he's blunt.
That Jesus Christ matters for all things that matter. And so every sermon is an argument, every homily is an argument, every essay is like he is making it because there are things that are not Christ.
You can do both.
Yeah. And I think frequently one of the things that frustrates me in my own denomination is you have I experience a lot of public proclaimers proclaiming in a way that, like, you could just be talking about the inventory at Best Buy. Like, it's like it doesn't sound like you're like this has really gripped you in an existential way. So Stanley, like, is adamant that, like, and part, often when his, like, 4-letter words come out is because, like, this, like, like, the gospel fucking matters. And
Yeah.
you need to, like, convey it. And you can't just go along to get along and turn the other, look the other way just to be inclusive or hospitable or keep the peace, or that he's willing to, but he does it in a way that doesn't let go of the nonviolent love of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't have to be flamboyant to be passionate. You can tell someone who's speaking in a kind of softer tone, but there's still, like, deep engagement with this, and then it actually matters to them, and you can tell that it's that the word is working, in them. I grew up around a lot of flamboyant preaching, and sometimes that can be just a show. But
Yeah.
then, you run into those flamboyant preachers where, man, this person has got a hold of God, God's got a hold of them, much more importantly. And so,
And to
yeah,
your earlier
I
point, Todd, I think what Stanley and Robert Johnson do well is Jesus has to matter for more than just your personal salvation.
Right.
That if he truly is, if he is the son of the God of Israel, then
Yeah.
he matters for what you do with your genitals and your pots and pans too.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
So Todd, I have monopolized conversation here.
No, it's good.
I don't think so.
I always try to kind of think on the other side. Baptists can be bombastic, and that's often considered a mark of sincerity. Loud and boisterous and quite emotive. And so we can sound a lot like we believe this, where it doesn't sound like we're reading the Best Buy inventory. But in as is often the case, or as is sometimes the case, the lived out realities don't match in as equally surprising ways.
Yeah.
And so I only probably throw that out to say that there are other ways that insincerity or a lack of conviction shows up. And so when you were pointing to the difference Christ makes, these are the sorts of things that resonate with me coming from that particular direction. On 131, he's giving I was going to try to give a lead in, but because he said something and then it's a however. However, this is but a reminder of our distance from Paul. Paul does not think that the church has to make a difference. Rather, for Paul, Christians must learn how to live in the light of the difference Jesus has made. And so, I mean, when I got to this last section, and I think you and I may have talked about it on the phone once before we started this, that because it is taken from a variety of essays, there are bits that sound an awful lot like. And my fear at some point, of course, was someone's going, "Well, haven't we been talking about that? Have he said that?" But the reality is that we're having it repeated actually reveal that we need that. In other words, in every way he could possibly say the same thing multiple ways demonstrates the importance of saying it for us. Because where someone standing in your denomination presents this way, some in mine are presenting this way, and so all the different ways Stanley is able to refract that idea and cast different lights in different spaces means that he's working real hard for the entire church to hear, which goes back to the mosaic that you pointed to that was his own experience. And I find that a great value, that when you hear someone who's been doing this as long as he has saying the same thing different, it means that we don't always catch the nuance required to catch everything that's going on in the rupture he's revealing in the difference Jesus makes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think one of the frustrations people have with Stanley is that he's never written a systematic theology.
Mhm.
You know, so which is something that Jensen did do at the end of his life. But so Jensen said the gospel can never be proclaimed the same way twice, because Jesus is alive and he's making promises to a particular people, and so the promise is always going to like land differently. And Stanley's, most of his written work, are essays for events that people have asked him to address. And so there are themes that remain the same and things that he says that are the same, but it's all contextual. And so I think in that way he's not just a preacher. He's a preacher in the way that all Christians are called to preach. That he's bearing witness to Jesus in a particular moment and context.
Yep. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And it's you I dug your 131 too, and because so we've been talking about the mosaic. Ken, you're going to Scotland with Chris Green. You can tell Chris that one of the things the mosaic he's put in place for me is he's made me aware of what a bad reader of the Bible I am.
All of us. He's done that for all of us.
And
True.
and so there's something, and it's obvious too. But so Paul, Paul, especially Paul and the early Christians, do not have the luxury, or the power, or the wealth, or the network, to like entertain the things that Christians in America think about, like affecting history. So, Paul's been confronted by the risen Christ. So he think, Jesus is Lord. He's coming back. And so the big things are kind of taken care of. And so all the ethics in Paul's letters are like, you ought not to do that. Like in the meantime, so we take these very context bound, occasional, like Paul trying to be
like from Galatians this Sunday, right? This coming Sunday. Yeah.
And so when we take those, we lift them out of Scripture, and then we turn them into universal principles that don't even need the church, and that's like a terrible way of reading the Bible.
It is.
It's a terrible way.
No one who does these things is going to enter the kingdom of heaven. That's true, because God's going to burn it all out of you before we get there. That's the way you're supposed to read that. That's the way you're supposed to hear that. Because you're trying to burn any of that stuff out of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that is, and like to bring it to like present day. I remember one of the first things that grabbed my attention that Stanley wrote was an essay in response to a statement that the United Methodist Council of Bishops put out in the 80s about the dangers of nuclear armament, and how the arms race threatened the future of the planet, and like that's theological nonsense. It's just, they're like no, it's like we're not in charge of the future. Like we can bear witness to
Yeah.
it, but we're not in charge of the future.
Yeah.
Nor should we be afraid of it.
At the same time that we can say that those are demonic,
Mm-hmm.
arrangements of metal and chemicals and everything else, but we have a hope that, transcends, whatever nightmare we're going to make of the world. Yeah, that's important.
So here's the last paragraph here, from this book. We should be ready to be surprised by what God may do to us and with us. We may have thought we could just show up on Sunday to hear the word of God and share a meal, but before we know it, we may find ourselves in jail. He's referencing Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
because we are Christians. Being the Church of Jesus Christ could actually get us in trouble, just as John the Baptist and Paul got in trouble. Being the church could be dangerous once again. By God, sisters and brothers, being Christian could turn out to be more interesting than we had imagined.
Yeah.
And like Stanley does, he's done that for me in my life. That he's a reminder that being a Christian is interesting.
Yeah.
And he's reminded me that like Paul wasn't like trying to be a martyr. it just happened that was yeah. So
That's good.
Yeah. Well, thank Ken. I'm glad that you were able.
Yeah,
to
Ken.
Actually, this is
Good to see you. Yes.
Yeah.
fortuitous.
It was fun. It was fun. It was fun to see y'all at Fleming's thing and to see Todd's, taking care of you in terms of getting some good pictures of you and Fleming and just respecting that relationship, which we all do.
The 100 people who are here now don't like. You're not going to be interested in this at all. But as soon as I click end, it all goes away, so I can't talk to Ken. So Kristen Deedy?
Who?
Kristen Deedy? Do you know her? She knows you.
I do.
Okay, yeah. So she was one of the leaders of the first year fellowship at UVA when I was a student there.
Yeah.
Oh, you knew that?
You told me that you were at UVA with her.
When did I tell you that? Because I just found out last week.
Via text message.
Oh, all right, okay. That must have been when Todd was over serving me. But such a small world.
It is. Yeah. She's dean of Wycliffe.
Principal.
Oh, excuse me. Principal of Wycliffe now.
Yes.
Yeah. What happened was
Anglicans.
When went to Western, right? And to start the Eugene Peterson Center. And I started making lots of trips over there, to be with them and do stuff and so forth. And Kristen's husband, Trygve, is right at the center of all of that, Trygve John. And also, Eric Peterson. And slowly but surely, I got to know Kristen just hanging out in Trygve's backyard. He's got a big man cave back there, and fire pit and all these kind of things. And eventually, she asked me to come, be part of what they were doing at Western, and I had to decline because there's too much going on. But they gave her an endowed chair, at Western a couple years ago. And Fleming, Mr. Sociology came from UVA, and Fleming was there, and yeah, she's great. She's a really really sweet person. Very nice. Very bright.
Yeah, and it's it's a good reminder to me of like obviously there's lots of Christians everywhere, right? But in a lot of ways we are a small tribe, and it's a helpful reminder. That one of the reasons why it's not on us to make the world come out right. Is like there aren't really a lot of us.
Yeah.
So,
no.
and that's And that connects back to our earlier conversation this morning with Rabbi Joseph, Todd, that,
Mhm.
you know, like, yeah,
Right.
Jews don't sit around thinking about how to make history come out like, you know, that it's
The way it's
there's just
supposed to.
there's just not enough of them. Like,
Right.
it's like, how do we
Yeah.
live together? How do we try to make sure that the country that we live in isn't going to kill us?
Mhm. Mhm.
Like modesty.
Right.
Yeah.
So Joni wants to know what's next. I
Hmm.
don't know. I don't
Not
know.
much.
But Joni, if you have an opinion, we are willing to listen. We'll probably take a little hiatus because Josh is getting settled and I'm going on vacation and Todd.
I'm going on vacation.
Yeah. Because let me look at Josh. He looks so old. He needs a break.
There you go.
I definitely think Ken Tanner should like dress as Gandalf for Halloween. So yeah,
Maybe I will. My grandchildren would like that.
yeah.
They were watching The Hobbit at our house, you know, the one that Peter Jackson did, the first film. And you know, Gandalf comes on and I was like, hey, who does he look like? You know? And they're like, oh hey, you know, Pop. So a lot of fun. I've got to let this house get back to my children.
There you go.
They're all flying to California for a wedding tomorrow, and I got to give them back the house. I've been telling them to be quiet for an hour, and they've got a lot they're trying to do in the background.
Tell them thank you on my account.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Right on, y'all. Peace
All
of
right,
Christ
thanks.
be with you.
Joni
Bye.
says another
And
Fleming
also
book,
with you.
Todd.
I saw that.
Much love.
All right. All right.